First in the Ukrainian war and afterwards in Gaza is that more and more politically the debate and the influence are not in the Security Council but on the General Assembly. I do believe that in the General Assembly there's a huge majority of countries that agree with this petition made by the Palestine Authority to get that full membership of the UN.
Around the General Assembly, though, and countries on the General Assembly, and I've had it on this programme with the President of Brazil, for example, there's a claim there's double standards going on here. When you look at Ukraine and Gaza, if attacking hospitals and bombing civilians is wrong in Ukraine, then why was it not wrong in Gaza? Do you think the Gaza statements, the Gaza policies of some of your other Western allies are going to make it harder to get international support for the other war that's still going on? Perhaps we're not focusing on it so much in Ukraine.
From my perspective, what I see is that we have a current position, in Spain, and we are with Ukraine because we defend a world order based on rules. And one of these main pillars, as you know quite well, is the respect of the international, of national sovereignty and the territorial integrity of a country, which is nowadays not respected by the way, a full member of the UN Security Council, the Putin regime in Russia. And because we are current, we also are current and very vocal on the war in Gaza, because what we are witnessing tabled a lot of questions. One of them, if it's Israel respecting or not and fulfilling or not the UN Security Council resolutions or for instance, the international humanitarian law. So again, I think that because we are current in Ukraine and in Gaza, we are defending, the international law.
How worried are you about the situation in Ukraine? Because a year ago there was all this talk of a counter-offensive. Since then, by the Ukrainians, since then and in recent months, very slowly it seems the Russian side are the ones that are making gains. Gaza has all the attention. It means that potentially the funding, the weapons are going away from Ukraine. And then you have another spectre on the horizon in November. You might get President Trump back in the White House. He might pull the plug from President Zelensky completely. Are you worried that Ukraine's going to lose this war?
I don't think that Ukraine is going to lose this war, because today everybody in the world knows that there is a nation called Ukraine that wants to be respected and defend their own freedom in order to be closer to the European Union and to our values. And by the way, to be member of the European Union in the coming future. So I don't think that they're going to lose the war. And I don't think that Putin is going to win the war. Not at all, because in the beginning of the war, what he wanted to do is to invade 100% of the territory of Ukraine. And this is not the case anymore. So I think that the big risk is that we are witnessing a kind of frozen conflict.
Prime Minister, you skillfully dodged the last part of my question. President Putin, you say, is not going to win the war in Ukraine, but President Trump might well win the election in November. He says he can sort this out in a day. He could undercut President Zelensky. And as you know, there are all sorts of fears. I mean, he's doubting Article 5, the basic rule of the NATO Charter, the all-for-one rule. If one's attacked, you all support them. Are you worried about the possible return of President Trump?
Well, I'm a progressive...
Tonight, bipartisan outrage over a journalist being kicked out of Colorado's Republican Party Assembly.
First of all, have great relations with President Biden and his administration. And, I would like to be him re-elected as President of the U.S., but this is something that has to be responded by U.S. citizens. What we are looking for is to have the best relations with the U.S. administration, Trump or Biden or who is in charge of and leading the country. And I think one of the major bonds between the US and Europe is NATO, is our transatlantic bond, our transatlantic relation. And I think this is above the Prime Minister or the President of one or other country. It's something that is strategic for the security not only for Europe but also for the US. So I don't think that we are going to witness a weakened position of NATO in the coming years in the case that Trump wins the elections. What we are going to witness is what we are seen over the past 2 years, which is a stronger NATO. And this is caused by Putin's war. This is the paradox. The paradox is that what Putin wants was not only to invade Ukraine, but also to weaken NATO. And what he has accomplished is the contrary. Now you have Sweden, you have Finland, you have a stronger NATO, and then within the European Union we have a stronger conscience that we need to do more on our defense and deterrence capacity. And this is something that we are already doing within the European Union. So I always say that we don't have a problem with the Russian society, but we have a problem with a regime which is putting into question the borders and therefore the security not only of Ukraine but also of Europe and therefore of the whole world. And this is something that we need again to solve through diplomatic ways. But unfortunately today is not possible. Let's see and let's hope that in the future we can find that way.
Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
About $10,000 on mailers and another $7,000 on postage to send a mailer at the end of February that attacks one of his potential opponents, Jeff Crank, and also Nikki Haley, and the local newspaper in Colorado Springs. So I'm not sure why other people have covered some of those things too.
Yeah, that all sounds like good journalism to me. Look, we did reach out to the Colorado Republican Party, and Dave Williams gave us this statement. He called you a quote fake journalist, and he accused you of sneaking into the event, even though, as we just laid out, you did receive press credentials at the door. He also said this, quote, "The Colorado Sun is just an extension of the Democratic Party's PR efforts, and the only backlash we see is from the fake news media, radical Democrats and establishment rhinos who hate our conservative base and who always look for opportunities to bootlick the crooked press or pundits who hate true Republicans and President Trump." There's a lot in there. What do you make of the language in that statement?
You know, I have to say what I really appreciated is all the Republicans who've reached out to me privately and on social media to support me. This isn't about me. This is about democracy. And there were about 3,000 to 4,000 Republicans there on Saturday doing work that represents the 900,000 registered Republicans in the state and the unaffiliated voters who lean to the Republican Party. And those people deserve to know what the party is doing on their behalf. And that's what I was there for, to report on that.
And it sounds like, as to your point, it's not just Democrats and the media coming to your defense. It's other Republicans who see this as really beyond the pale. Sandra Fish, thanks for joining us tonight. We appreciate you doing that.
Thanks for having me, Abby.
And thank you so much for watching Newsnight. Laura Coates Live starts right now.
There is so much news out of Trump legal world tonight, it threatens to eclipse every other story. See what I did there? I'll tell you what we've learned about the questions that'll decide who gets to sit in the jury box for Trump's hush money trial. Plus, Donald Trump throws some of his fervent supporters under the bus. Why his statement on abortion could cost him Republican votes come November. And women's basketball celebrating record viewership for last night's NCAA championship game. And while South Carolina established themselves a true dynasty, now there's a warning for Caitlin Clark and her future. Tonight on Laura Coates Live. All right, now raise your hand if you want jury duty. Okay, well, keep them up if you want to be on the jury for the first criminal trial against a former president. Now I see some hands. Well, today might be your lucky day because I've got the questions that potential jurors are going to have to answer to possibly be selected for jury duty in that hush money trial. Now, the trial is actually set for 1 week from tonight on April 15th for jury selection. Now, mind you, Trump is trying again to get that trial date pushed back, claiming that he would not get an impartial jury. Well, no dice. State appeals court judge said no. It's going on April 15th. This is the trial, just to keep everything straight for you. The one in New York where the former president is accused of falsifying business records to cover up an alleged affair with adult film star Stormy Daniels. And make no mistake about it, who is ultimately on that jury is arguably the most important part of the trial. You're going to hear some of the
call to aggression holds no value. I'd like to comment on Netanyahu's today's statement about an imminent attack on Rafah. This raises questions about the purpose of resuming negotiations, especially with confirmation of aggression and crimes against our Palestinian people. The success of any negotiations depends on ending the aggression.
Hamas al-Houthi has occupied East Jerusalem, with more on the latest round of negotiations.
There's been no official comment from the Israeli government about the potential of a ceasefire being secured, but the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that he is being briefed on these negotiations in Cairo. An Israeli delegation was present for the talks, and they were given a mandate by Netanyahu, but what exactly that mandate entailed, they did not speak to the public about. This comes as Netanyahu is under immense pressure, both internationally and domestically, to secure a deal to release the remaining Israeli captives who are still held in Gaza. On the domestic front, you have a population of Israelis who is protesting against Netanyahu and his governance, saying that he has failed to secure a deal to bring back the remaining captives and that he should be removed from office immediately. On the international front, you have many countries around the world, specifically Israel's biggest ally, the United States, who says that there are a lot of issues with Israel's pending ground invasion into Rafah, for which Netanyahu says there is a set date for. Now, all of this comes as the Americans and the Israelis have had many disagreements over this over the last several months, but Netanyahu maintains that it is critical to invade Rafah, where more than 1.5 million Palestinians are seeking refuge, in order to achieve an absolute victory in the war. Hamda Salhout, Al Jazeera, occupied East Jerusalem.
Omar Rahman is a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs in Washington, D.C., and he says there are still a number of sticking points in the negotiations between Israel and Hamas.
I think it boils down to a couple things. In one sense, it's the duration of the ceasefire itself. Obviously, Hamas is looking for a permanent ceasefire, and the Israelis are not interested in that whatsoever. It's also about the place Hamas has been pushing for the Israeli army to pull back completely, or at least into certain areas. And it may be that the word aggression is about that, whether it's the use of force or just the presence of the Israeli military inside the Gaza Strip in the long term. So I think we're getting down to the issue of semantics and what those words mean in the context of an agreement. When it comes to the statements of the Qatari mediators and the Egyptian mediators expressing some optimism, I mean, they're doing so in relative terms, relative to the past few days and weeks in which it looked like no deal was going to get done. So I think there's some cautious optimism there. But Hamas also said that there's been no progress, and the statements, if we take the statements of the Israeli Prime Minister, it doesn't look like there's been much progress. But yes, when you're getting into these negotiations, it's very important. Obviously, the numbers and where Palestinian civilians, if they can return home. Israel seems intent on preventing Palestinians from returning to the northern Gaza Strip as it sets up, this very wide buffer. There's also obviously the issue of prisoners and how many hostages. So I think those are less important, working out those exact figures than some of these big picture issues around duration of the ceasefire.
The US says it's received no word from Israel on its plans to launch a major military offensive in Rafah. Patty Culhane reports from the State Department in Washington, D.C.
The news that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had set a date for Rafah came just before State Department spokesman Matthew Miller briefed reporters, and he said the U.S. has not been told what this date could be, but he reiterated that the United States has been asking for and has yet to see a credible plan to deal with 1.4 million people that are in Rafah. Previous administration officials have stressed they have nowhere to go. So again, the United States is saying that when it comes to a full-scale operation into Rafah, they are completely against it.
We have made clear to Israel that we think a full-scale military invasion of Rafah would have an enormously harmful effect on those civilians, and that it would ultimately hurt Israel's security. So it's not just a question of Israel presenting a plan to us. We have made clear to them that we think that there is a better way to achieve what is a legitimate goal, which is to degrade and dismantle and defeat the Hamas battalions that still remain in Rafah.
Now, the U.S. officials have met with their Israeli counterparts to talk about how the U.S. sees this mission going forward, because the U.S. says they agree that Israel needs to target Hamas in Rafah, but they need to be able to do that while protecting civilians. And we expect they're going to have another meeting, possibly as early as this week, potentially very early next week. But the U.S. is using much stronger language now. They have said again from the podium that Israel's policies need to change, and if they don't, then the U.S.'s will. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera at the State Department.
After days of mounting international pressure and warnings of famine from humanitarian organizations, Israel says it allowed 419 aid trucks to enter Gaza on Monday. It's the largest number of trucks that have been sent to Gaza in one day since the war began 6 months ago. On Sunday, Israeli authorities allowed 322 trucks to enter the strip, most of them carrying food. Before the war, 500 trucks entered daily. Aid organizations accuse Israel of slowing the delivery of humanitarian supplies and using starvation as a weapon of war. Tariq Abu Azoum is in Rafah and has more on the movement of aid.
These aid trucks till now did not enter to the Gaza Strip, as they have been widely inspected by the Israeli military, and right now they are stationed on the Palestinian side of the border, where generally these aids will be completely distributed here for people in the south. And it's worth mentioning also that these aid also include some trucks for the private sector that will be directly delivered to the traders, who will be later selling these commercial goods for the majority of Gazans here in the south part. Until now, there is no any kind of a humanitarian convoys have been allowed to be delivered to the northern part of the Gaza Strip, and as we have been observing in the course of the past 2 days, there is a slight increase in terms of the number of humanitarian convoys, which yet has been seen by the UN aid agencies as not sufficient, as they are saying that the Gaza Strip in a very desperate need for at least between 500 up to 600 humanitarian convoys in order to be consumed on a daily basis, in order to match the immense unprecedented needs for the majority of displaced Palestinians who are right now here, are facing are also struggling in order to get meals, amid also people there in the northern part of the Gaza Strip who did not receive much needed life-saving supplies, amid more signs of famine looming on the horizon for people there who did not also manage to get much of aid, also medical supplies, despite the Israeli resolution and decision to open areas of crossing. But till now, this decision had been not yet practically translated.
Israeli artillery fire has killed at least 8 Palestinians in Khan Yunis. People were targeted as they returned to what's left of their homes to search for any belongings. Most Israeli troops have withdrawn from the area. Israel's defense minister says that's aimed at preparing them for a ground offensive in Rafah. Some Palestinians had hoped they might have homes to return to, but there is almost nothing left standing. Ali Mahmoud in Rafah reports on those returning to their devastated homes.
For some of the first Palestinians to go back to Khan Yunis, there isn't much recognizable left. Once home to around 500,000 people, this city in the south of Gaza has been flattened by Israel's military.
The city looks heartbreaking. It's unbelievable. We didn't expect this scale of destruction. There isn't a house without a martyr, wounded or destroyed. Words can't describe it.
Many of the people who have been living in tents or in the open for months on end were hoping there might be some way to start rebuilding their lives.
We came to see what happened to the house, but there weren't any houses here. It's just rubble. You can't live here. Animals can't live here. So how's a person supposed to? The destruction is unreal.
Israel's military announced on Sunday it had withdrawn troops from Khan Yunis. It wraps up a key phase in its battle with Hamas. Troop levels now are at some of the lowest levels in Gaza since the war began 6 months ago. But there are still reminders that this is still a war zone. Rebuilding Khan Yunis will take many, many years if Israel allows it.
And for the 1.5 million people sheltering here in Rafah, the threat of an Israeli ground invasion remains. Ali Mahmoud, Al Jazeera, Rafah in southern Gaza.
Nicaragua has asked the International Court of Justice in The Hague to order Germany to stop supplying Israel with weapons immediately. Germany is the second largest arms exporter to Israel after the United States. Nicaragua argues that Germany is complicit in what the ICJ has already ruled is a plausible case of genocide in Gaza. Step Varsen reports from The Hague.
For 2 hours, Nicaragua laid out its case against Germany.
Please be seated. The sitting is open.
Accusing it of facilitating genocide, 80 years on from the Holocaust.
Germany emphasizes that its assistance to Israel is a raison d'etat because of the historical treatment of the Jewish people during the Nazi regime. That is an understandable and laudable policy if it were addressed to the Jewish people. The Israeli state, in particular its present government, should not be confused and equated with the Jewish people.
For the first time, 2 countries appeared at the International Court of Justice, which aren't directly involved in the atrocities at stake. But Nicaragua argues Germany is indirectly involved by sending arms and ammunition used against civilians in Gaza. German weapons exports to Israel have increased tenfold to $323 million in 2023 from $32 million the year before. Research Institute Forensic Architecture has documented recent sales of torpedoes, tank ammunition and engines for military equipment and the lease of so-called Heron drones.
German companies involved in the military industry are directly profiting from the situation as they have seen their share prices rise since 7 October.
In his book, Whitewashing and State Building, Daniel Marwiecki writes that Germany's post-war military and financial support for Israel has mainly been about Germany's own rehabilitation.
In the beginning, the relationship has nothing to do with morality and a lot to do with pragmatism also on the Israeli side, which however has changed. So today I would say that there is sort of like a moral dimension to the German support, but it's not only moral. Nothing is ever only moral.
This case is seen as a test for international justice. Can a country that is not directly committing atrocities be held responsible for facilitating them? A Dutch court recently ruled that countries selling weapons are bound by international treaties, meaning that these weapons can't be sold if there's a risk of humanitarian international law be violated. And Nicaragua argues that this is the case in Gaza. Germany has dismissed Nicaragua's allegations.
Germany does not and never did violate the Genocide Convention nor international humanitarian law, neither directly nor indirectly.
She said she would give more details during Germany's defense on Tuesday, when it has its turn before the court. Step Varsen, Al Jazeera, The Hague.
Still ahead on Al Jazeera, some of the worst flooding in Russia in decades leads authorities to declare a state of emergency in some regions. And a rare total solar eclipse is seen across North America, bringing daytime darkness to millions across the continent.
Hello, we're looking at some rather lively weather developing across southern parts of the US. So you can see it's not too bad at the moment, but this area of low pressure will continue to drive its way further eastwards, and its trailing weather systems are in the process of ramping up. So some really wet weather coming in across the deep south, Texas, Oklahoma, pushing across towards the Tennessee Valley. Some wet weather too over towards Lakes. Ahead of that, look at the warmth, 21 Celsius in New York, 70 in Fahrenheit, 25 there for DC. Now this very wet weather becomes more widespread as we go on through Wednesday. There will be the odd tornado wrapped in here, gusty winds, large hail, the usual shebang, and that will continue to drive its way further eastward. Somewhat drier and brighter over towards the west. Just a little bit of mountain snow there into Colorado, maybe into parts of Utah as well. But over towards the west coast, it's fine and dry, coming down into much of Mexico as well. Southern areas of Central America will still see a few showers towards Panama, Nicaragua. Could see a little bit of weather there into Costa Rica. Still a chance of the odd shower too into Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and over towards the leewards. The showers here become a little more widespread as we go on through Wednesday, but brighter skies somewhat further west.
Hellish scenes in the Gaza Strip as Israel's onslaught continues. There's a deliberate omission of Palestinian humanity in Western media, and it needs to be questioned.
Sustained coverage that actively humanizes Israelis and actively dehumanizes Palestinians.
This is not the time for journalists to turn away.
Tracking those stories, examining the journalism and the effect that news coverage can have on democracies everywhere, here at The Listening Post.
Watching Al Jazeera with me, Elizabeth Garner in Doha. A reminder of our top stories this hour. Hamas says that Israel didn't meet any of the group's demands in the latest round of ceasefire talks in Cairo. A senior spokesman told Al Jazeera that the Israeli Prime Minister's latest threat to attack the city of Rafah raises questions about resuming negotiations. Israeli artillery fire has killed at least 8 Palestinians as they tried to return to their homes in Khan Yunis. Emergency workers have retrieved the bodies of 77 other people there in the past 24 hours. That's after most Israeli troops withdrew from the area. And Nicaragua has called Germany before the UN's top court for what it says is the aiding and abetting of genocide in Gaza. It's accusing Germany of serious breaches of international law and failing in its duty to prevent genocide.